And welcome to part 19, following the restoration of our 2-foot gauge Fowler, Tully Sugar Mills number 5. This is about the pony truck, and in particular, to start off with, the load beam that goes over the top of the pony truck itself. Looking in plan view, you can see the A-frame as the outline there, and the axle going across, and then straight fore and aft in the middle is this load beam, which as the pony truck goes round the corner, it swings, as my finger just demonstrated, it swings like that left and right, increasing the load on the pony truck as the engine goes into the corners. A clever bit of design really from Fowler's to increase the load on the pony truck when the engine goes into corners to keep it on the rough track work of a sugar mill environment. The bearings themselves, heated up here from an earlier video and knocked off, needed replacing. They're worn eccentrically. You see it's thin at the top there and fat at the bottom because the load on the beam itself is just one directional straight down. The beam, as you can see, is pitted and burred, so we'll clean that up in a moment. But the difficulty was how to machine up the ends properly. So there's two big bars here clamped down to a big faceplate to hold the beam and drive it in the lathe. We subcontracted this work out because we didn't have a lathe big enough. The idea is that now you've got access to the journal on the right hand side here with the tool post set back near the tailstock. We could machine that, and then they could flip the whole thing over to get the other end up by the tailstock as well, so that it could be machined. I think it was a reasonable attempt at how to machine those journals, but unfortunately it didn't work. When we got it back to the workshop and measured it accurately, the ends were oval and beyond any kind of tolerance that we were happy with, so we'll come to in a moment how we address that. This is Dave cleaning off all the burrs, flattening it back, filling the big rust divots that were there with body filler and sanding it back. It's a huge chunk of metal, so it was never going to flex or move, so the body filler was perfectly stable in the rust pits. Again, it was all sanded, primed, painted, and you can see in the spray booth here it looks a huge amount better than it ever did before. So moving back to the end journals, they were oval, so we decided to put the beam on our milling machine, and with the 90-degree end quill here we're fly cutting down, and we're basically machining them round, but now they're undersize, so we had to sleeve them back out again with new steel sleeves round the outside, back up to the original sizes that we wanted. And that's what's being made here. There's essentially a tube section that's going to be a few thou smaller on the inside than the outside diameter of the journal that you've just seen us machined down, and then that would be heated and pressed on, and then it will shrink back to be really tight back on the ends of those journals there. So it's a way of getting it all nicely machined that we weren't able to do because we didn't have kit big enough. And even the attempt to subcontract the work out to a company that did have kit big enough, I think the mass of the beam was just so much that it was wobbling the tool, I assume, to machine the ends oval. So that you see Neil holding the new surface against the original, and there's, after, you can see it's sort of yellowed because we've heated it already, expanded it on, shrunk it onto both ends. So that's that all done and ready to go now nicely into the new bushes. The new bronze bushes, which essentially become the pivot point around which this beam swings, were held in these castings. You can see this is a shot before we started restoring it. There's one on the front, one on the back. We'd shot blasted them, cleaned them, primed them, got them back from the bead blaster, and then this is boring them out so that they're all nice and central and have a nice clean surface to take the new bronze bushes. You can see on the right hand side of the shot there the raw bit of thick walled bronze bar that we've got. To do that, the surfaces have been milled flat on both so that we can lay it flat on the milling machine, as my finger was pointing out there, so that we know that the bore that we're putting through is perfectly true and 90 degrees. And then Neil multitasking here, machining the new bronze bushes at the same time as the castings that house them being done on the milling machine. Here's a shot of the whole assembly. We've got the two new bronze bushes and the housings milled out to take them. There's holes in the bottom that you can see. That's because this housing's upside down. It hangs the other way round. There'll be a hole milled in the bush so that it lines up for getting oil into the bushes when it's all assembled. So now looking at the end view, this is the casting itself. There's the axle running through the pony truck. At the very bottom you can see in cross section the A-frame, and then above that is the section through the casting, which is the main part of the pony truck. You can see it here again before we restored it. It was in a messy state but substantially complete. You can see here there was a big crack, a big piece missing, and a couple of the feet were missing off the back as well. This same process was used on other parts earlier in previous videos. You can see the two pieces have been put back in again, and then they've been cast iron welded back in, and this is part of that process. They're halfway through at that point. The insulation material is over the top, so there's a gas burner to heat the whole casting up to quite close to melting point, and then locally it's heated up with a much hotter torch just to melt that point. And you can see here under the green screen, because it's very hot and bright, the rod, the square rod, is cast iron and melting in there to put more new material on. They're the original feet, and on the back side you can see a much chunkier new foot that's just been added in the same process that you just saw happen at the top end. So that's much thicker than it needs to be, but there's plenty of material on there for us to mill away. Just a little bit of prep work before it can go on the milling machine then. Here's Dave grinding away with the big Dremel to get rid of some of the overcast, just some of the thickness of the casting where we'd repaired the cracked collar, just so it's an easier cut for the milling machine to do once we get it that far. And in fact, that's the next stage. So the next thing was for Neil to take the casting and clock it up on the milling machine. So this is Neil explaining that he's getting it flat, and we've got the dial gauge here reading down a slightly ribbed surface, so it's flicking around, but ostensibly it's flicking around the same levels, and therefore he's got that casting lying flat to the bed. Yep. And it's been clocked up that way as well, yep, so that we know everything's square both directions, and then Neil can take a cut off the feet. This is the original feet that are only taking a little skim off just to clean them up and tidy. And then above on the top is the big fat thick feet, which is essentially new cast iron material that we've added. A lot deeper cut needs to come off there to bring them back, but we did decide to leave them over thick. But the fatness obviously was added on the top, just because we thought a bit thicker makes them a little bit more stable, and there was plenty of space. We were making our own nuts and bolts there, so it didn't matter if there was a little bit thicker than they started. Again, here you can see we're just finishing off, making them square. Sitting down there, it's now the other way around. You can see we've left this one slightly fatter. Again, just to give it a bit more strength, seeing as it's new material. With all 4 feet now skimmed flat, we could flip it over and address the bore in the top. You can hear it's taking meat off from just here, where this is the brand new section that's been repaired, where the crack's been completely repaired. So it's fatter, it wants skimming down, just a very thin skim off everywhere else to clean the surface up, before flipping it over the other way. There was another area down the bottom here where it had been worn. If you look down at the bottom of the picture here, you can see there's a new piece of cast iron material being added there. We had to do that on both sides. The axle had obviously been sitting at a funny angle and it had been wearing through. It had obviously run for some time, presumably in service, with the bush having been completely worn away, because it had eaten into the cast iron in a round axle shape. So essentially we had to fill all that and then machine it all out and skim round, as you can see here, with again the 90-degree quill to get in there. It's really tight casting, but you can see we could just get inside to machine it away. And again, you can see that new material being machined back here for the readiness for the bronze shell to go in the slot. That's that side finished. Pretty much the whole of the internals are done now. We just got to remove any straight square edges, because a 90-degree square edge is a fracture point, a weak point. So we ran the radius milling cutters down all of the edges just to smooth off, so that there were no sharp edges. The next stage was to reintroduce the pony truck A-frame. As you can see here, it's all been cleaned up and painted and tidied after going through the shop blaster. We repositioned the holes ever so slightly, just tweaked them a little bit to match with the new feet, because obviously the new fat feet that we made out of new cast iron material were not exactly in the same position. So we've just tweaked them a little bit so that the new bolts could go through there in a more stable and strong position. And that's basically it for the main part of the casting. And Neil's just doing a little last minute just double check on the centres. We've got a little bush placed in the machine centre for the pivot point for the pony truck, and Neil's just double checking that the centre line for the axle is where we wanted it to be. It's not an absolute science, that, but it's close enough just to check like that. This is a photo looking down from the top of the pony truck before we started restoring it. You can see that the top cover is completely missing. We'll come to that in a minute. Here's the drawing showing you the actual side section of it, with the bottom sprung casting that goes inside the fractured collar that you've just seen us repair. The two telescope together, squashing the spring, which is guided by the pin down the centre. It's flipped upside down here so you can see how worn the pin was, again eccentrically. This is a recap from an earlier video. We machined out the pin because it was just solidly, it screws in, but it was solidly stuck. So we've machined it out, and there's a washer stuck to the bottom of it that came out with it. And then we've bored very, very carefully. You can see just revealing the top of the threads so that Neil could then get in there and pull the actual remaining metal out that was wrapped into the thread. So the metal that you can see here isn't just normal swarf, it's actually the thread peeling out from the remnants of that pin.
That's to see what we're trying to achieve there, can't you know?
And then a new pin was made, and you can see it here being trial fitted into the recovered threads in the hole. A nice fit, which is always good. You've got full control over the size of the threads that you make, so if you're trying to match a new thread to a worn existing thread, it's possible to cut the new thread slightly over size so that everything's sort of bespoke but fits really nice and tight. And the nut for the other end's bespoke as well. It's a nut retaining a washer on the end of the pin, and essentially if the engine comes off the track, that nut and the washer retains the whole pony truck bottom end on the engine. You can see here thread cutting the nut. It goes inwards with the lathe going towards you, and then it's all indexed together so that when you go back the other way, the cutter comes out again, cleaning the thread and cutting it further. So that's the nut done. It'll go now onto the milling machine, onto the indexer, to cut the hexagon flats on it, and the pin itself is screw cut in exactly the same way, with the lathe moving towards the headstock one way and then peeling back the other way, all linked together so it constantly goes through the same grooves on the cut. It's screw cutting on the lathe. You can see the tool following the grooves of the thread all the way up, and then Neil putting the bare bones of the new nut onto the thread just to make sure everything was nice and tight. Moving back to the main casting, the top casting is a separate piece, as you can see here. It was missing completely on our loco. It retains the load beam, which obviously in this rear view comes back towards you in the shape of my finger. That's the beam that obviously requires the cap to squash it down to increase the load on the spring. We were able to borrow a pattern in this instance from Jonathan Whitehead, a friend who's restored a similar Fowler with a very, very similar, identical in fact, pony truck. So thanks for that, Jonathan. We borrowed the pattern, made castings, and this is Neil machining the casting up. Again, boring out the holes, which you can see got a test bush there just to make sure, as a little check, just to make sure that the milling machine was boring true. They were then threaded, and also the pin down the centre had a hole bored and a thread for a large grub screw to be put in there as a key to stop the pin itself from rotating. Once that was done, we made 4 new bolts. The bolts themselves all bespoke to fit the new casting to the original. You can see here they were round first, and then they were placed in the indexing head just to rotate them round through the 6 flat surfaces. This is fitting the brand new casting fully machined with the new bolts to the original. Once they were fitted together, clamped together tightly, they could then go back in the milling machine for the boring head to bore through that correct diameter to take the load beam itself. You can see here through the 2 sides were nowhere near because it's obviously a brand new casting, but they're bored out to exactly the same so that it fitted nicely onto the bar itself. And here's Neil fitting it. So all fully lapped in, that can now be taken apart for painting. If you look on the top of the casting, there's 2 little holes. Originally from the drawings, they're just oil holes. There's a flap in the foot plate which you lift up to drop oil in there. We've replaced those with grease nipples, which just makes it a little bit easier to get grease in there consistently for a more robust use. The nut you can see is all finished and on there. That's it for this video. There'll be another part 2 for the pony truck following soon. Thanks again for watching.